Look at that. All sorts of fun. Okay. Just getting all great. Yep. So welcome everybody. We're just hanging out for another couple minutes since it's right on the hour. Everybody is, we know how everybody is with the Zoom schedules these days, always running from one meeting to the next. So we're going to give it a couple minutes before we get started on the webinar. So just hang out. Hopefully you can all see the screen and we're feeling good and looking good, most importantly, because that's critical. It's critical to success in vulnerability management is looking good. But Gene, we have a little bit of a call it like a, not a reputation, but like a thing that we do occasionally on these webinars. And I have to ask in the 2 minutes of small talk before we get started, do you have any good cybersecurity jokes? I always have to ask just because, it's funny how creative people can be, and no judgment if you can't, but I always love hearing them if anybody's got them.
Man, no, I don't have any good ones. They're just, none that I would mention. Yeah,
Okay.
none that I would mention. Just we just to keep it not from an offensive standpoint. I think we have to stay PG.
That's fair. Yeah, we try to push the PG a little bit here at Nucleus, but
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not going to ask you to do that.
I think a lot of them are, a lot of the cybersecurity jokes are definitely offensive, just because, my goodness, some of the things we do is just crazy anyway.
Well, you're a pen tester, Gene, so could you say that your job is offensive?
I would say that, yeah. I don't really consider myself. I guess I have pen testing in my title, and kind of from either from a process, people, and organizational standpoint, business, from that kind of standpoint, but definitely offensive. And that's a mindset I think it's more and more as we go along that people are getting, because they're not in silos. And
Yep.
you have to think about these things, because nobody wants to wind up in the news.
That's a perfect segue into welcome everybody to the Nucleus webinar for May. As you may have noticed, we're joined here today with somebody named Gene Bandy, who is works at R1. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Gene. We're here today to talk about the 5 areas within vulnerability management that we see as the patterns as to why organizations have a hard time scaling their process, or really getting on top of remediation, or if your goals are to really increase your maturity level, maybe you're following the SANS vulnerability management maturity model. And so these are the areas that we're seeing patterns with most organizations, and how they really struggle going from level 0 to 1 to 2 to 3. And we are joined today, and we're very excited to talk to you about it. And we're excited to talk to you. I'm joined by Gene Bandy. Gene, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, my friend?
Well, Gene Bandy, offensive security manager for R1 RCM. R1 is a medical services company. We provide services to hospitals and different medical organizations and I'm part of the side of it that provides the security for it. From a security standpoint, we for the offensive team.
Excellent. Yeah. And for those that have not, or that are either new to the Nucleus webinar series or don't know who I am, my name is Scott Kuffer. I am one of the co-founders of Nucleus, and work on, have worked on all sorts of stuff, vulnerability management, my entire career. Very exciting to everybody involved, especially family members and all of the above. And we're providing this webinar. We do these monthly. They're not a vendor or Nucleus pitch, right? We think that there are enough vendor pitches out there in the world. Our job is to deliver valuable content that you can use to help either take back and build vulnerability management strategies, processes, plans, all of those things that you need around a tool like a Nucleus, or whether you don't want to use Nucleus and you're using whatever types of Splunks, however you're doing vulnerability management today. Our goal is that you get some really great takeaways that you can leverage back internally to your organization. And the way that we do these things generally is through a very interactive approach, right? So some of these webinars actually end up being primarily Q&A, and that's totally cool, because the reason that we're a big fan of that is we bring on great guests like Gene, who have tons of experience. They've been doing this for a long time. And this might be your only opportunity to actually get to ask questions from a real life expert in the wild. And so we strongly encourage questions. But just so that we know where everybody is hailing from today, feel free to light that chat up. Let us know where you are calling in from and listening in from. If you're on LinkedIn, feel free to leave comments in the live stream. We're excited to have you here, and we're really excited to talk to you about the topic today. So we already did the introductions. Look at that. Number one, crossed off the list. We're making great progress. We're going to now break it down into the 5 main challenges and patterns that we see when it comes to vulnerability management struggles within organizations. We're going to talk about some step-by-step processes and things to think about on how to overcome those individual challenges. We'll obviously be doing Q&A throughout all of it, and then we'll have some closing thoughts. And as always, these webinars are being recorded so that you can take them back to your organization if you find value in them. Some topics we've done in the past around SLAs and SLA maturity, the difference between SLAs and SLOs is part of that, ticketing workflows, prioritization workflows, things like that. So just for context. So let's go ahead. We're 5 minutes in. Let's kick it off and start with number 1, right? Let's waste no time. Gene, this I'm going to pass over to you because I believe you have some very specific experience with labor-intensive processes within cybersecurity. So why don't you get us started with our first challenge that most organizations face?
Yeah, I'm going to add too. I think from the legal lawyer brain side of me, I'm supposed to say that my comments are my own and not the one of my employers. But the to kind of go from off of that, you know, vulnerability management is, it's near and dear to everyone's heart from an IT standpoint because you're at the pointy end of the spear. And there are lots of things involved in this process, and knowing your organization, knowing the assets, knowing the services that you're using in the process, and then actually tracking and maintaining all that. Just it's just a grind. It's a love. It's something that you have to just kind of be involved in, and you got to keep up with it every day. I mean, there's not really a day off for vulnerability management, especially when it's when you've got a global organization that you're trying to keep after. And kind of like one of the things that I kind of put in here is my quote. It was like, you want to be the first of the finish line in this race, so you don't wind up on CNN.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of those questions, right? Like, I mean, one of the ways to boil this down is just data volume, right? In a lot of ways. And so there are a ton of processes built on this. Where do you see, Gene, like which areas are you seeing like the majority of the friction when it comes to these labor intensive processes? Like, is there anything in particular specific that you're like, man, this thing just really sucks and we'd love to be able to get rid of that as a bottleneck? Which is there anything like that you see?
It being different. I think the real struggle has been, um, the depth of the organization. If it's a large organization, the struggle is like the siloed expertise or the siloed services of that. The visibility has always been, the optics of what you're looking at, and from an offensive standpoint, it's always the low hanging fruit, right? That you're trying to fix first, to patch fast, and um, and then maybe the inside of your environment which is a little more hardened, but obviously has the same type of resolve from audit compliance standpoint. But I think just trying to get your arms around the whole thing, and then planning it, pushing through it, and then proving that you've done it, and then you know that is like the labor intensive process of it, in my 2 cents.
Yeah, excellent. And I see there's a raised hand. If you want to just drop your question in the chat, we're happy to answer them live. So I don't think we have the ability for folks to actually like say things on these. So yeah, if you got a question, feel free to drop it in. We'll answer it. I will say from like the Nucleus side, or from my side, unfortunately, Gene, I don't have the same luxury to say that my opinions don't reflect those of my organization. I could say that, but as a founder, it's kind of hard to for anybody to believe it. So what we look at is what we call data, we call them growth levers ultimately, right? Like when you look and you start to peel back the onion of your opportunities for where all of these labor intensive processes actually come from, it's funny, right? Because there's no silver bullet. It's never just one thing that is actually the main bottleneck. It's actually very much like a what do you call it? Like a situation where you like start to like just die by 1,000 cuts type of thing, right? It's more like that where there's no individual gaping scenario where it's like this is obvious, and there's a whole bunch more than even these subcategories, but on the one side, you can look at it very much as, hey, there's tons of labor intensive processes, and this is really difficult to manage. But then on the other side, you can look at it as these are opportunities to have huge impacts. And, that's what we call in the startup world, we call those growth levers, which is like what individual small levers can we pull that are going to create asynchronous outcomes or like really, really big outcomes. And so just to pick a few from the VM space, there's actually somewhere around 50 to 75 sub processes, depending on how you want to look at it. And that's part of what makes VM so complicated, right? Is that there's so many options, you don't know where to start. And so this would be the list that we normally would start with when we go into an organization. We would say, hey, well, you need to be able to take all your assets that you know about. You don't have to have every single asset documented, but 80%, 90% is better than 0%, right? So you get all the assets you can into one central location. You then can take your vulnerabilities and you can start getting all those into one central location. And when we talk about like the opportunities to automate, when I think about, and I'm curious your thoughts, Gene, I did that backwards. If you actually look at saying, hey, we're going to do nothing but start automating asset normalization. What is the impact of that compared to trying to automate vulnerability ownership tracking or trying to automate the triage and decision making of how you prioritize vulnerabilities? Like it gives you very specific and clear guidance on how to dig in and say, this is what we're going to solve. We can set that as a goal or an OKR if that's how your organization tracks goals. And to me, it feels like a much clearer way of approaching like this giant elephant that it's just seems too big to get started anywhere. But is there anything in particular that like do you agree with that, Gene? How do you feel when I make an assertion like that?
Yeah, that's a valid strategy. I would agree with that. I think people struggle with the services and the asset management. I think that's a daily struggle with everybody, and especially if you're growing or you've got a large organization, and that expertise at that level to know where to go look in the silo that you've got the scanning for that or whatever, right? Um, for that process. But yeah, you've got to have some sort of prioritization, and this makes sense.
Yeah, so one question we got in the chat was, and I think you might be a perfect person to answer this, which is what size generally do we see for a TVM team for, say, a hospital that has 15,000 employees or so?
Man, I have seen that kind of all over the place. Um, 15,000 employees, that's big. That's a lot of responsibility. And typically those teams fall under InfoSec, and I've seen it fall under infrastructure, but you know, depending on how the team works itself, I would have to say at least three people, just for coverage, one being probably the manager of the group. And from that, the person's, people, it goes back to the whole thing of the sprawl of the process and kind of what you're systematically going through and the ticketing system and the madness that you get involved with that. And then it's a blend. I think one of the things is it a blend of on-prem and there's a blend of cloud assets, and how well is that organized, and is that all in one system? Are you working through multiple systems? Is one done through Microsoft and then one done through Tanium or some other tool that you're using? I mean, or yeah, I mean, it all depends on kind of how you're trying to manage that. And I guess it could get uglier if you're doing it all manually or you don't have anything to kind of from any kind of automation standpoint. It gets uglier from there.
Yeah, I know from my perspective, I've seen I've seen it vary as well. And honestly, the thing that I see as like sort of the biggest indicator of what the size of the team should be is really where the areas of responsibility end up, right? So let's say you've got cloud infrastructure and cloud assets, right? If you have a dedicated cloud team, right, you can actually make the argument where you have them own the vulnerabilities, and then VM becomes more of an information sharing process where they don't necessarily do anything other than just manage the security, like almost like an MSSP in a way, where you just sort of they do the scanning and then they present the results, and then the cloud team is actually responsible for its own security. That actually allows you to minimize the number of folks that you need inside of a dedicated VM team. But if you need to embed a VM expert into, say, the cloud team or various AppSec teams, there's going to be specializations within your VM team, and you're going to need more people as the kind of breadth and responsibility of that team comes up. I would say 3 is a good number from what we see, but I've seen it anywhere from 1 in an organization. I've seen 0 in those types of organizations, and I've seen 10. And some of that is driven by compliance as well. So part of that is hard to answer without deeper information. So anywhere in that 0 to 10 range is probably considered average. Probably closer to that 3 to 5 would be the
one person it just seems like a one-arm paper hanger. I mean, wallpaper hanger, man. I just like you're going to be busy. I mean, you're going to just be
yeah. Oh my
one
gosh.
person
Yeah.
is going to be tough. It's
I'm
going to
getting
be
overwhelmed just thinking about it.
yeah. So
Which leads us to one of the areas that we did want to dig into today is within these growth lever areas is actually ticketing, right? So one of the areas that a VM team is generally responsible for is managing, not directly, but managing tickets and work for other teams, right? Because VM teams are not generally able to remediate on their own. And so one area that we really wanted to dig into was why ticketing workflows are so ineffective. And Gene, take it away, man. I know you've got lots of experience here.
I put this quote on here, made it PG, because I really do think that a lot of some of the things that we do in vulnerability management, we get bogged down. And some of that, could it be, automation that makes this process happen? Could it be, you know, and automation to me is, the holy grail of that, right? I mean, it's always going to be the outliers that you'll be chasing them, and then you'll be trying to fix the automation. So it's a sandwich. I think it's a rotten egg sandwich we all eat in vulnerability management land. I know I've eaten it at several locations, several orgs, and it's just part of the daily grind. Everything we do in IT, it's always got to be, there's got to be tracked. It's got to be, that we know that we've got it done, and we know we're meeting our compliance and our security requirements. And like I said, anything that could make that better with the tool set that you have, because what you have has to mesh into kind of what you're building in. And I guess sometimes if you're lucky enough to have multiple tools that make that happen, yeah.
I don't know. You say lucky enough, man. I think about scenarios where you've got one organization that uses Jira and ServiceNow and BMC Remedy, and I immediately go to the pain of having all those tools work together, and it makes me sad. So I almost like the idea of a single ticketing system, but I guess it depends culturally on your organization too.
Yeah, I mean yeah, you just named a really nasty, 4 horsemen of ticketing. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure everybody's dealing with that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to move like to where we see this like really start to eat people. Right? You mentioned the rotten egg sandwich. I feel like we've come to enjoy the rotten egg sandwiches here at vulnerability management teams. But if you trace the vulnerability through a normal process, it really makes it clear on why this happens, right? So let's just walk through a single vulnerability. So vulnerabilities gets discovered on an asset in a normal basic ticketing workflow. Then you have some sort of vulnerability person who triages that vulnerability, decides, is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Should we fix it? Should we not fix it? Risk accept, all those sorts of things. Then they go and they'll create a ticket in a tool like Jira. Then you have the team whose board that is consumes the ticket from that communication system. then that team will often create their own sub tickets or subtasks, or they'll pull it off and they'll track it in a different backlog for their sprints, and then they go track it on their own. And then the VM teams have to go back and then review the tickets in order to follow up and follow the loop on a individual vulnerability. So a vulnerability ends up becoming a ticket that oftentimes is 2, 3, 4x removed from the vulnerability itself, right? And so what starts to happen is you lose a lot of this tracking of, well, what happens when this finding shows back up again in the next scan next week, and you didn't fix that vulnerability within that time period between scans? And so it's really difficult to validate actions and map. Like, and these aren't even like fun, fancy, sexy topics, right? Like, it's just a pain to be able to follow up consistently on, hey, we're having to track findings, and now we're also having to track the tickets on those findings. And if you don't have a link between them, it becomes really challenging because your VM team is no longer, I'll use Jira as an example, like JQL, the reporting query language in Jira, doesn't make it easy to look at links upon links of tickets, right? Or because most of your reporting would be through links, for example. So it creates this huge loop of manual work. And when we go think back to the labor intensive processes, it makes a lot of sense why the labor intensive processes exist. They don't even happen inside the VM team or inside the VM tools. They happen in all the other systems that you're required to use in order to make action happen, right? So like information versus action becomes really, really challenging. And then also you end up creating a boatload of tickets, right? So
So,
it becomes a problem that nobody ends up fixing anything.
and you get log for Jade, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
log
I
for
mean,
J, log for
I,
shell, log for
I
whatever.
mean, yeah, it's like you're like just when you think you fixed it, it happens again, and then you got to have your teams are going, you what? Is this a mistake?
Dude, so many times. And you lose, what ends up happening is too, is you lose, speaking of culture, like you lose a lot of trust and yeah, a lot of trust in your VM organization when this happens, right? What happens if like I fix a vulnerability, but that wasn't the real vulnerability that needed to be fixed? And then I asked to escalate a fix within a sprint and throw off a product release, but it
Oh yeah.
turns out it wasn't really a critical, important vulnerability because after the fact, we determined that it actually didn't have exploitation associated with it or something, right? And so you end up having to manage expectations and culture as part of this, which is also super manually intensive because it's relationship management, which is very difficult to automate.
Oh yeah. That's relationship management is the cornerstone of VM teams.
I know us engineers love that, right? But obviously, we're talking about the context of Nucleus here, so we are going to use Nucleus as an example. It doesn't have to be Nucleus. There's other systems and ways of doing this. We're just using this as an illustration of how actually adding a step and adding a process in the middle of that, it seems like it would be more complex to actually do something like this, but the benefits actually vastly will outweigh the downsides of adding an additional step in your data processing. Because a tool like Nucleus, its job is to start doing a lot of the triage that a vulnerability analyst would do. You program in the decisions that should get made, and then also the ticketing decisions that should happen as well. So you just eliminated that whole process of, let me look at new data as it comes in, let me go create tickets, et cetera, et cetera. And then because a tool like Nucleus, again, various ways to do this, but a tool like Nucleus is smart enough to know and provide the linking between all the tickets that have been created downstream to the vulnerabilities themselves. You have the ability to say, hey, let me just look at all of the vulnerabilities and see the associated tickets with the vulnerabilities. So it provides that whole kind of end-to-end workflow that gives you that massive visibility. And the way to leverage this and way to think about it is actually to think about the reason that we came up with this idea in the first place was traditionally, when you think about vulnerability management, most organizations think about it as that circle, right? I call it there's a whole bunch of circles out there, but it's, the old school, like, prepare, identify, assess, react, report, like doing that in a circle. We don't necessarily like that as a concept because it it's not really how the process works. Like we're having to map to software development life cycles. We're having to map to patch management cycles. And it's a lot more accurate to think about the vulnerability management process like a pipeline. And it's very similar, actually. In fact, we have whole talks on this that we've done to explain like how product management and vulnerability management are actually pretty much the same. The difference is that you have orders of magnitude more data with VM and you have orders of magnitude less people with VM. So but you're expected to roughly do the same job. And on average, we see that for every 10 new vulnerabilities discovered, somewhere between 0.2 and 2 vulnerabilities are actually within your ability to fix. And so you have 8 that you just can't fix. And so the question is, well, what do you do about those? And how do you prioritize so that those 2 that you're fixing are the absolute most important ones to fix? And at the same time, you have the ability to start pushing that number up. So we fix 2 out of every 10, then 3 out of every 10, then 4 out of every 10. There's a velocity and a prioritization challenge. And so when you're thinking about ticketing and you go back to that whole process, it's okay, well, there's automation here, absolutely, but also automated prioritized decision-making too, right? It's trying to do both together, which is why this is such a great growth lever in organizations to insert automation inside this part of the process, as opposed to other places within the process. If you can pull it off, it's huge, huge impact. Again, share a link to push metrics to Power BI. Okay, so James asked a question about pushing links to push metrics to Power BI. I'm assuming you're asking about Nucleus in particular in this case. In that case, yes, absolutely. You can do full data exports and data pipelines out of Nucleus after all the data has been aggregated and stuff. If you want more information about that, obviously we're happy to set you up with demos and things of that nature. Just let us know. But yeah, thanks for the question. Now, I know this one is near and dear to your heart, Gene. So I'm just going to stop talking. I feel like I've been monologuing for a while. Tell us, everybody, why this is so important to you.
Yeah, I guess this is what we all kind of chase from to keeping us kind of out of the news scenario. I mean, obviously we're looking at lots of things, but what jumps us, what makes us all jump on Saturday morning and good to have those great relationships with the other people on your teams is a 10 pops up on a critical application that you have. And you go, hey, we got to fix this today. And I think that is that goes back to that whole relationship and your what process and where you are with your with your ability to find these things, and or the tool you're using that was going to spell these things out for you to go, hey, this is bad. You see it in the news, you see it maybe you don't see it on the news. A lot of times, this CVS stuff is like 2 days lag, and you're like, okay, well, yeah, how bad is this? And then you got to go research it and figure it out. But I think this is from my standpoint, there's a lot more things involved in this process, from the whole scoring, where you have to also look at the market and and kind of what you're doing and how critical the components are that you have that have these vulnerabilities that are found. Cisco, Palo, and a few others have had some recent vulnerabilities that they didn't score. They just said high. And it was kind of like, oh, that's great, or critical. And then you kind of have to make the decision there, okay, do we do remediation? Do we actually, is there a patch for it? And does it work? And those are kind of like, does it work kind of falls back on my team from the standpoint of like, well, let's go see if there's a POC or there's somebody that dumped some code out there. And then we try to exploit it from that standpoint. But that's my relationship with the vulnerability management team internally. But yeah, there's a lot to this process, and it just doesn't fall into the numbers game.
Absolutely. We had a great question actually from the chat, which was from Vince. He was asking about, what do you do for vulnerabilities that don't have a fix yet from the vendor? So he offered up a couple options. Do we filter those out of reports? Do we ask teams to take additional steps? Like how do you manage that today, Gene, or historically even?
Well, even historically, you look at it, if it's a perimeter device, then what mitigation steps can I take to maybe whitelist it down to only my only need to know, or people that need to actually have access to that, and or is there things that is sometimes the vendors will say, okay, if you change these things within the device, it mitigates that attack. But I mean, until you attack the device or you actually test the device yourself, you don't really know if that stuff works. I mean, we've seen that too many times. It says, oh yeah, this is fixing it. And, I go back to Log4j. It's kind of like, that didn't work. And then you have to then you get three of those dead code things. So, and then you drive everybody completely, absolutely nuts over the whole process of you patching it. But I, it's all a mitigation depending on the device. Is it internal? Is it external? And what are the things that you can do that obviously doesn't affect business? Because the best security is transparent security, in my opinion. It's where the business just looks at it and goes, "Oh, it's magic." It's just we're all looking for the holy magic button for security, and I think that is where you know when we can do these things that mitigate risk, protect us from the Russians that are crawling the low hanging fruit, the Chinese that are scanning everything that we own. Just keeps us, from all getting that free pen test.
Hey, free sounds good to me, Gene. I don't know what you're talking about. That sounds capital efficient. Uh, but so you said something there that was really interesting that I want to take another step at. And you said something along the lines of everybody being on the same page in a way, right? And I think it was around clarity is what I heard, right? So one of the questions was from Vince. Your question was around what do we do with vulnerabilities that don't have a fix from the vendor? And I think you have to divide that into multiple categories of what do we mean by that, right? So on the one hand, you've got the what do we do about it from a reporting perspective? There's the what do we do with it from a remediation perspective, right? And I think you need to look at those differently. So on the reporting side, we have to then subdivide that into risk reporting versus vulnerability remediation reporting. So from a risk reporting, you absolutely want to not filter those vulns out because risk is an accumulation of risk and you want to know all of the items that lead up to that risk, regardless of whether or not you can do something with it, yes or no. And on the flip side, you're going to have a vulnerability remediation type of reporting where you might filter that out because you have decided at a high philosophical level, we are not going to go to the effort of fixing vulnerabilities that don't have a vendor fix under certain circumstances. But that needs to come from your and be informed by your threat model at a high level of how you want to decide how to prioritize those vulnerabilities and where fix available yes or no is a particular criteria within that, which brings me to the remediation side, right? So that's the reporting side. And I think you need both, unfortunately, is the answer. If you want full clarity, you're not necessarily going to bubble all of that up to the CEO of the company, but I will tell you that the C-suite executives tend to be more interested in the overall risk reporting than they are in just the, hey, here's how we're doing vulnerability remediation reporting. Like it all translates basically to, are we at risk? Yes or no? Are we at risk of losing money, reputation, etc.? That's been my experience. I don't know if you've seen something different, Gene.
I'm absolutely with you. And you know what I mean? It goes to a monitoring level. It goes to, what's your security operations? Can they monitor things more, microscopic? And or God forbid, like I think some of the things that have come up lately are, you get a report from the government says turn it off. I mean, yeah, all bets are off at that. So, I mean, and I feel sorry for those people, but the mitigation standpoints, like you said, it's kind of like you have to bubble it up, and it depends on the risk and the use and the placement and kind of your abilities to mitigate that for sure.
Yeah, which actually I think leads into why and how you can leverage this actually. So Vince, you asked a great question. You hit the nail on the head in terms of some of these things that we think about as vulnerability prioritization experts, right? And I always like to start with what do all of the traditional prioritization tools have in common, right? So traditionally, historically, it's CVSS. Then there was this new thing called EPSS. For those that aren't familiar, exploit predictive scoring system. You've had risk scores and risk scoring. Then you had something called risk-based, which is actually not the same as a risk score, but that's a whole separate topic for another day. Everybody talk to your Gartner analysts if you have time. But what do these all have in common? And what they all have in common is that they're looking at individual items to say this particular thing poses the most risk to the business. And at a high philosophical level, you're like, great, that makes a lot of sense. We're looking for the thing that is going to decrease risk the most. The problem is that businesses don't think in terms of individual items that pose risk to the business. They think in terms of outcomes and ROI and, hey, how much money does it cost to fix a vulnerability? And so if it costs us $500 or $1,000 to fix a single vulnerability, like the prioritization is, well, what actually is going to give us the maximum amount of risk reduction for our money, right? As really the calculus that they're doing. And so we proposition an idea that we call precision-based prioritization versus efficiency-based prioritization and the mapping between the two. So to answer your second question, Vince, which was around the, do you ask teams to take steps to compile their own software packages to contain a fix before a vendor? The answer is going to be it depends. And the reason that I say it depends is because there are certain scenarios where fixing the thing using incidents to drive your remediation activities absolutely makes sense, right? Log4j was one of them. A scenario where you're going to be, oh crap, there's no vendor fix, but we need to get something fixed before the vendor pushes something out. That to me is the break glass scenario of the, we need to pull the fire alarm and do something that's above and beyond what we would normally do. Then there are certain vulnerabilities, which is, I would argue, the majority of vulnerabilities that go into this other bucket of, hey, they should be fixed in the context of ROI within groupings of items, right? So, hey, we know that this patch is going to fix the X amount, most number of items. Hey, this particular version of the container image is actually going to fix X number of Kubernetes pods downstream, right? So thinking in a much more business focused way is how you would, that's like your subdivision between whether or not you're going to ask a team to compile their own software fixes versus just wait for the vendor. And you need to have the ability to make those decisions at scale with solid reasoning, right? So the reasoning we normally use is say, take all your context that you can. So vendor fix is just one attribute, sure, right? But if you just say, hey, it's a critical severity and there's no vendor fix available, you can't confidently make that decision that you should do software fixes, right? You're going to have to say, okay, well, we also know that this thing is being weaponized and it's being used currently in ransomware. And oh crap, it's threat actors are actually targeting my industry with that ransomware, with that vulnerability. And it's on a public facing asset. And that asset has, it's in our DMZ and it has access to the internal network if they compromise it. That scenario, 100%, you're going to be trying to roll it and say, compile your own software fixes right now. Like, call somebody, we're doing it. But if it's a dev system internal that nobody's touched in 5 years, you might just roll it into your regular patching cadence. So it really is heavily dependent, I would say, on your priorities. And that's why I wanted to really break it into reporting versus remediation. And then there's actually branching within each of those categories on how you answer your question. So anyway, that was a very long-winded way of answering your question, Vince. But we have a lot of opinions and have done that a lot throughout the years. But yeah, Gene, I don't know if you had anything to add. I know I kind of soapbox there for a bit.
No, dude, no, that's you nailed it. I mean, it's all about how your organization's gonna, consume that and mitigate.
Oh, yeah. Which leads us to number 4, which is funny enough, one of my favorite topics, because for those that don't know, this was one of the reasons that Nucleus exists in the first place, is for this very problem. We were experiencing the inability to scan fast enough and analyze the data fast enough. But anyway, I'll let you take it away, Gene.
I, you know, this is, I guess this whole thing to me is, you know, you really gotta, it's part of that whole race that you feel like you're in from a vulnerability management standpoint. I mean, we're always trying to categorize, and we're always trying to be the first to find these things or to discover the next attack vector. And like I said, this is something where yeah, I've seen it done wrong, and I've seen it, done to where, you create a lot of noise. And I I don't know, there's a mix in there somewhere, and it depends on the bag of tools you have and the resources that you have. And it's like I said, it's a mixed bag with this process.
Yeah, what do you, from what you see, Gene, are you are you seeing what is the normal scanning cadence within most organizations that you've worked with, and has it changed? Because I know when I first got into the industry, quarterly and actually annual was acceptable, but quarterly was sort of like the standard of like what good looked like. I would say in my experience that's changed somewhat,
Yeah.
but have what do you see as sort of a good scanning cadence, and then what's like a good scan coverage percentage in what you're seeing?
Wow. The tools that a lot of us have access to now, really they're scanning all the time. I mean, especially if you're using agent-based components or some of the newer services. But from a scanning, if you were just flat foot scanning, uh, you know, it depends on the type of scan. From a vulnerability management scanning, I mean, it kind of goes back into what I'm looking for. It's one
Yeah.
of my goals is to find it first, fix it fast. Is to I scan, no matter what, we've always scanned, 3 times a day. Because if we're not scanning it or trying to beat it up, somebody is. And that's the thing from an external side. And like I said, because you get all kinds of people, oh, why are you scanning that much? I was like, I go back to it. I said, well, if I'm not scanning it or trying to, do whatever we're doing with it, somebody is going to be scanning for it, because it's public. And, just because you think you know, you have it whitelisted or the other processes that you have in place, people make mistakes and people, so you have to always be kind of diligent with this process. And if you can use tools that utilize a daily process or maybe even a twice a day, 3 times a day process, depending on the tools that you have and the availability with, I I don't think you can do it enough personally because things change so fast. It's
Mm-hmm.
just overnight we could have something fall completely apart.
Yeah. So if you had to choose, I'm going to put you on the spot here. If
Yeah,
you had to choose between we could scan all of our external attack surface continuously and nothing else, maybe like once a quarter for everything else, versus you could scan once a week across the board, what would you choose and why?
I would choose continuously. Like I said before, I don't think if you're not scanning it, somebody is. And when something pops or somebody's hunting for something that maybe you have, or they've done, some open source intelligence on your organization, or they trolled your LinkedIn and found out what you're looking at, I think, you know, they're, I mean, you better be scanning it and being able to patch it as fast as you absolutely can, or you're going to wind on, up on the news. I mean, I can't. Yeah, I'm not the person definitely that's just scanning once a week. No,
Yeah, no, I was curious.
no, yeah, I'm definitely for continuous scanning and as much as we can on a risk-based approach. Like, okay, like everybody, if you've got any type of company, you've got an offensive security program, one of the first things you're going to do is collect all your assets. And you're gonna say, okay, you're going to individually score those assets. And you're going to go, okay, yeah, these are high value, these are low hanging fruit, these would be nice to have because maybe they're service providers or vendors that are part of yours that you could compromise and pivot. But
Yep.
I mean, when you're doing that, I mean, that's that whole risk-based approach in scanning as well. And maybe there are some things internally that you don't really need to scan that much often, but I think if you're not treating it the same, maybe you're doing it wrong.
Which leads us to what do we see as the normal reasons that scan coverage and scan the ability to scan continuously actually happens, right? So, I always like to go with the 5 whys method, right? Thank you, Toyota, and really start to peel back. And if you haven't noticed a pattern yet, at Nucleus, we're really big on the what's the reason behind the reason behind the reason, right? I love to dig deep on what is actually causing this, and so when I say, hey, why don't we have scan coverage? What tend to be the biggest reasons that we see as to why we don't have the ability to scan continuously? And these are some of the ones that I see where it's like, hey, we don't like one of the big things is, well, we don't have access to that system. Okay, well, it's a security team who's doing a security assessments. Why not? Right? Like that's an immediate question that I always have. But a lot of it actually comes from, hey, maybe we've got unique environments and there's not actually the tooling out there to really assess adequately. And I really think about the medical environments where we start to say, hey, well, like, there's some simple stuff out there, but, maybe not, right? Like I think about, there was this tool, I think it was called Medigate. Does that sound familiar? It was,
Mhm.
I think it was bought by Armis a few years ago, but it was all
Okay.
about like, how do you scan pacemakers and those types, CAT scans and those types of things. So there are some specialized tools out there for most markets, but yeah, it's a big challenge where that definitely can happen. But I don't know about you. Most often, the reasoning that I always get is that, hey, there's just too much data. So if we scan every minute of every day, somebody has to review it. Otherwise, it's useless. So why bother if we can't review it? And to me, this is the biggest opportunity for improvement, where it's like there are 100% solutions and patterns out there to solve that for that problem. And then sometimes the expectations themselves are too high. Well, we actually expect that we're going to be able to scan every single day within 30 days. But it's like, well, you've never scanned more than a quarter, every quarter since the beginning of your entire company, and you're not even going to get through change management processes fast enough to get to the point where you could deploy an agent that quickly, right? So these tend to be some of the reasons that we see. And again, I'm a big fan of, if you really understand the problem of what you're experiencing, and you have to go through that process as a company to figure out why we're not able to get the coverage we need. And then from here, you can say, great, well, how do I solve this problem? It's not that I'm trying to solve scan coverage. I'm trying to solve the behaviors and the root of the issue that's going to lead to the outcome, which is a higher metric within scan coverage. But yeah, Gene, I don't know which of these resonate with you. I mean, is there one that stands out to you even more as like, this is what I see as Gene?
I think something that you mentioned hit me. From the standpoint of like, are you getting too much data, right? Like, I mean, what is too much, right? I mean, and then is it too much because you're not categorizing it, or you're not managing the process, and kind of like, what are you doing targeted things that are actually what you've considered your solid gold targets. Like,
Yeah.
these are things that we have possible vectors, to steal or to hack or to compromise. And that all needs to kind of go right into why you're doing the scanning and why you're doing the continuous monitoring for that process. But too much data, and it depends on, I guess, also maybe the tool that you're using too. I mean, I guess you could get the tsunami of reporting and get lost in it.
Yeah. No comment in terms of yeah, I mean, like some scanning tools definitely over report or over classify, and even if you're scanning every day, they
But
don't
that's
do.
okay, as long as you've got a understanding of like, okay, yeah, this is what this is doing, and then I have this doing this on purpose because
Yeah.
I feel like this risk validates this process, right?
Yep, absolutely. Totally agree. So anyway, so our solution here would be to go through the process of a 5 whys exercise to ask yourself why you don't have enough scan coverage, and really figure out the reason, like at a deep level, and have an opinion and a thought as to why, and then fix that. And then, we promise that will make a meaningful impact on your scan coverage KPI, especially if you have to do that for federal government compliance. Uh, Congratulations, by the way. Federal compliance is fun. But it's funny, right? So we just said, hey, we don't have enough scan coverage. And at the same time, we're about to say, but we also have too many tools. So Scott and Gene, which one is it? And the answer is yes. It is both simultaneously. And it's hilarious that we're in this predicament where we've spent so much money on too many different things, but we still don't actually implement them as effectively as we would like. Um, but yeah, Gene has way more experience with that than I do. So I'm going to pass it
It's a
back to you.
dance. It's a
Yeah.
waltz. I mean, you're gonna, how you manage these tools and how the teams use them. Um, you know, they have to kind of fit together, and they tell a story at the end of the day, because like, or they tell a story upon, when you, like, I think it was Vince was talking about, or is it, yeah, it's James talking about going to BI, right? I mean, because you've got a BI roll up dashboard, right? It's going to tell a story about where you are. And and I and I think if you don't control the tsunami of that data, man, you just drowned in it. And like I said, here it's definitely a balancing act.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think this is a good moment before we jump into the final solution here. Vince asked a question about a good strategy for getting contextual business information in a programmatically consumable way. I'm assuming about assets, right? So it sounds like he's tried to create a tagging standards. It's Word docs and Excel and forms for people to fill out, but having a hard time to get teams to actually do it. So, uh, do you have any advice for Vince here, Gene?
And from just a tagging and bagging and trying to get your arms around the assets. I think that's what this is talking about. Creating
Yep.
a standard. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to do if you don't, if you're not gonna, have your infrastructure guys and, all of your ops people and, everybody come together and have a meeting and discuss like, okay, how are we going to do this? And then because I think you can have the best laid plans, but I don't think if you've communicated it, um, a wise man once told me that it's not dog food unless the dogs eat it. And I think this is a great example of like, you might have the best laid plans or you might have the best tool or whatever. And then if everybody doesn't kind of believe in it, it goes back to relationships maybe. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's got to be some sort of systematic plan. But yeah, other than kind of all getting together and agreeing on the resource to how they're going to categorize stuff is.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think that I do have some additional thoughts here, just because I've had the pleasure, if you will, call it that, of getting to do this in numerous organizations across the board. So, the question of, is there a strategy for getting contextual business information? It's interesting because, just like everything else I've talked about, there are two distinct ways to make this happen, right? There's the what data can we automatically collect, and can we programmatically, if we can automatically collect it, it's already in programmatic formats for us to consume. And there's actually a lot more there than you would expect, right? And a lot of this, the data, the metadata exists in various places in most organizations, and you just have to know where to look and then to be able to consume it from there. So like an example might be, just as a basic example, let's say we want to track ownership of Git repositories. Well, even if there's no tags or anything on those Git repositories, if you log into Bitbucket or GitHub or GitLab, there are teams that are assigned to those Git repositories, and you can say, okay, well, that team owns that Git repository. And it's not going to be 100% perfect, right? Because you don't have there's no system in place that you can, say, hey, we're going to leverage that system. But you have the ability to make really good educated guesses on what teams own individual Git repositories in that scenario. And let's keep going down that path. It is challenging, but what you can end up doing is that if you control the CI/CD pipeline, you can have automated tagging and automated systems at the CI level, not even on the vulnerability management side. And this is where relationships are so important, where you can say, hey, Mr. CI or Mrs. CI lady, we would like you to actually automatically tag and track in the labels field or in the tag field or whatever, just the owner or the ID of the team or the business manager, right, of that particular Git repository. And you do that for every PR. And then now you have the ability to link all that together to your larger uniform ownership map. And that's one way, right? And so meeting people where they are is one piece. But yeah, it is very difficult to get teams to do it by themselves, because you're asking for more work without real payoff to them. And so the other thing to think about here is there's process things you can do where you can say, hey, we're going to assign you stuff as a vulnerability management team, and here's your SLAs. Let's say you have buy-in, right? So it's dependent too. Let's say if you have buy-in from the executives that you need to fix SLAs, you can start assigning vulnerabilities to teams based on your best guess, and then they can say, hey, it's not the right one. And you can be like, well, I don't have the information, so you are accountable to this until you can prove otherwise. And now all of a sudden you have the ability to motivate them. And again, I don't necessarily say you should 100% go that approach. It's going to depend culturally how your organization works, and there's a lot of different creative ways to make this happen. But there are options that go beyond just, can you fill out this form for me? And happy to talk about that offline, Vince, if you want to send us a message or send us your email and everything. I'm happy to have a conversation about you or about that with you. But man, I could talk about that one at least for many, many minutes and many hours. So good stuff. Now, to pivot real on back to the final solution here is when it comes to, hey, we have too many scanning tools, we don't have enough coverage. You really have two options, and it's more of a spectrum than it is a binary black or white set of options. And so you really can go the less tools approach, or you can go a tight integration layer approach. So less tools basically says, hey, I'm going to try to consolidate as many of these as I can into a single set of vendors or a minimal set of vendors. So think about like, hey, I'm going to try to do everything through Microsoft. I'm going to try to do everything through Palo Alto. And, consequences be darned on like sort of the other stuff, right? And there are pros to that, right? One of the main benefits is that you have a lot less admin overhead because you have one vendor, you have one set of customer success managers. You have, maybe you're spending a lot more money with them, so you can actually get a higher level of service. So like individually, and costs then, so you get some benefits of, hey, we're going to throw in this module for free, and it might not be best of breed, but it's good enough for our use cases. So there are some real benefits to that. But on the flip side, you have to just understand what you're potentially giving up. And I say potentially because it depends, and you're giving up various different things depending on the tools. And so, like, for example, your coverage 100% is going to suffer because no one tool is the best at any one thing. And so let's say you've got Microsoft, you go all in on Microsoft. Microsoft Defender for endpoint, Microsoft Defender for cloud, and then they used to have Qualys scanning that they just kind of went away. So now you have, okay, you technically are doing CSPM plus endpoint plus VM within that stack, but it's not necessarily as good as, say, like a CrowdStrike plus Tenable plus Wiz, right? So it gives you that opportunity to say, hey, we're willing to give up some capabilities to simplify our use cases, but just be aware and okay with, and just make that business decision that you're giving up something. And that's cool, right? That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the one that I just described, right? Is you could literally pick 3 totally different vendors that are all best of breed and give you the maximum output for the amount of money you're spending on the discovery piece of vulnerability information. And so the benefits are, you get to leverage all the top capabilities in every market. You get all the benefits of a single vendor interface across all of those, right? So you could say, hey, we're going to plug in 15 different tools into one interface, and we're actually, no matter the differing levels of maturity of each tool's interface, they're all going to plug into a very mature, normalized interface, and all that's being managed like a single vendor. The only real downside that we always see is just it costs. It costs money, right? You have to buy all of the best of breed tools, which are oftentimes the most expensive in their space because they're best of breed for a reason, and they charge like they're best of breed. And then you have to basically either front the cost of building your own integration layer or contracting with a tool like Nucleus to sit on top of it and make that a seamless experience. And so it's going to cost more money every time. So that's why I think it's hilarious. Like, that's why I was sort of a joke here, where the pros are that sometimes it costs less with the vendor, but it always costs more with with an integration. It made me laugh, but hopefully you at home found that funny too. But these tend to be the two broad choices holistically that you can look at. And with that, we unfortunately are running out of time to go through the rest of all of this today. We did have a bonus one around building effective teams. Unfortunately, we won't be able to talk about that at this point, which is very disappointing. Maybe we'll get Gene to do a blog post or something about this so that we can still get you that sweet info. But that does roll into the webinar we have next month, which is how do you build a team? How do you build a human-centric vulnerability management program? And you can be able to really manage this at scale. And how do you leverage your team to get the kind of that special sauce of a small group of people really being able to achieve high-level outcomes? And I know there was one question about the CISA cyber hygiene services. Paul, we'll follow up with you afterwards to talk about the Sci-Hi service. We actually have a lot of experience with that. Nucleus also has some experience with the Sci-Hi service. And then, of course, if you're interested in Nucleus itself, this would be the QR code that you can use to get that. But with that, we have come to the end of our webinar today, and very much appreciate everybody's time. If you have any questions, or Gene, final thoughts for the audience as we go out?
I sometimes, building these programs, you're going to fail. Just keep going. I mean, do something even if it's wrong, because you got to, if you're not doing it, somebody else is. And you don't want the other people to. So I think that, you know, people, even that don't have these tools or these resources or these things that are all these things that are nice to have, just sitting down and being, passionate about making these things right is the kind of person that pushes through all this and secures an organization and services. And, you know, and even if it's a healthcare company, obviously we're, ultimately saving people's lives by doing this stuff.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you so much, Gene, for participating today. And thank you everybody else for sticking around to the end. And yeah, we'll hope to have you on again soon. See you, everybody.
Thank you.